All right, this is going to be for U.S. History, NTI, I believe Thursday, April 2nd. Today we're going to be talking about life in the 1950s. This is going to be the last thing we're going to be talking about in our 1950s chapter. There'll be a small quiz for Friday, and then of course you have spring break, so you have a week off just to enjoy with your families. And then we'll kind of see where we are after that. So, in the 1950s, obviously the focus is, now that the war is over, to kind of get back and to try to get the United States, back on its feet in terms of, back to normalcy, I guess. Very similar to the 1920s after World War I. So Congress passed the GI Bill of Rights, which encouraged veterans to get an education. Several, didn't get their high school education because they joined the military or to get some upper education. They gave them a year of unemployment benefits, low interest loans, and this was all fixed so that we don't have another bonus marchers. If you remember in the 1920s when the bonus marchers from World War I wanted to get their bonuses and the federal government said no, and then of course, they marched on D.C., and then Hoover kicked them out, and it was a big mess. So this was kind of obtained to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Housing crisis, I don't know what to call much of a crisis, but a lot of people were in the city, they were becoming overcrowded, overpopulated, and people wanted a little bit more space, and so they moved to the suburbs. Today, of course, and what the suburbs are, those are your cities around the big city. Probably a good example, you look like up around Cincinnati, the suburbs around Cincinnati. You got northern Kentucky, like where I grew up in Florence. You can kind of consider that a suburb of Cincinnati. But people would live in these cities outside the big city because it'd be less crowded. And you can see a lot of these early neighborhoods, all the houses look the same. And sometimes you still see that in neighborhoods today, but for the most part, today it's not like that. But all these houses were very similar. And everyone lived in these houses, for the most part, were small scale and could be built relatively quickly. Harry Truman. So, Harry Truman starts to build on civil rights. Now, the issue of civil rights doesn't really get tackled until the 50s and the 60s. But some significant things happened during Harry Truman's administration. Jackie Robinson plays for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947, becoming the first African-American baseball player. In 1948, Harry Truman integrated the military. So while these are small steps, these were still big steps in terms of the United States trying to address the issue of civil rights. And really, we will study that sometime post spring break. We'll look at how the nation finally starts to take that issue head on. Harry Truman is going to run for a term of his own. So remember, he took over very shortly into FDR's fourth term after he died. So he became after he became president. He's going to serve a term of his own. So he's elected, or he's nominated. There are two other candidates. The Southern Democrats, who were not very ambitious about Truman's civil rights platform, nominated Strom Thurmond of the Dixiecrat Party, which is basically the Southern Democrats. Strom Thurmond is going to be an individual that's around in American politics for a long time. He's going to be in the House, or into the Senate until I believe like the early 2000s. So you're talking over 50 years he was in Congress. The Republicans nominate Thomas Dewey of New York. Dewey was kind of seen as the front runner going into this election. You got to realize, we just had 4 terms of a Democrat, kind of post-war era. People may be looking for a little bit of a change. In fact, the Chicago Daily News, as some of the early returns came in, it looked like Thomas Dewey was going to win. And so they printed in their newspaper, Dewey defeats Truman. And you can see this famous picture down here. Truman, after some of the western states started to come in, took a lead and ended up winning the election. And so he holds up that famous headline that says Dewey defeat Truman to show that he was kind of the underdog that won. So Truman wins, and this is the 5th straight electoral victory for the Democrats. Truman wanted to institute something known as a fair deal, which was kind of to build on FDR's New Deal. And the big thing that was included on that was nationwide compulsory health insurance, which is not even technically what we have today. I mean, I guess we kind of have it in a sense, but basically, it would, everyone was required to have health insurance. And so that's something, obviously, that's a big debate about today, whether or not people should have health insurance. Should it be government-run health insurance, or should it be private-run health insurance? And so that idea of national health insurance started with Harry Truman in the late 1940s, early 1950s. Suburban lifestyle. So, as the soldiers returned from fighting in World War II, a lot of them came home and started families, and we saw the birth rate soar for about 20 years from 1945 until 1964. Of course, these are known as the baby boomers. And so some of your parents might be in this, maybe your grandparents, just depends on how old everyone is. But my parents were both a part of this. As you can see right here, the births per thousand are at its highest rate here, especially kind of the height of the baby boomers in the mid-50s into the early 60s. And that's because all these people are coming home, they're glad to be home from the war, they get married, and they have large-scale families. Okay, today the average family is like a little over 2 kids. But during this time period, especially you had a lot of Catholic families where you would have, multiple kids, in some cases 5, 6, 7 kids. And so, 2 things. People are excited to be back from the war, and also you're having larger families at this time. Women have a new role in the 1950s. It's kind of the more traditional or conventional role. So you remember during the war, they were called into the factories to build goods for the war effort. After the war was over, they came home and they took your more conventional jobs, kind of your more, we call the housemaker. They took care of the kids, they cleaned, they cooked for the family. That was kind of the more traditional expected role for women. Something about less than 40% of women actually had paying jobs. And then for the women that did have paying jobs, it was kind of your conventional jobs for women. Schoolhouse teachers, nurses, secretaries, things like that. So women during the 1950s take a more traditional, conventional role compared to what they were doing during the war. All right, Dwight Eisenhower. So in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower becomes president. Okay, and this is significant because this is the first time the Republicans had won a presidential election in 20 years. So that's a long time, especially as we're now what we call the modern era. And the reason why he won, obviously he's considered one of the war heroes. He's the head of all troops in the European theater. He chooses Richard Nixon, who gained a lot of notoriety and support in the Alger Hiss investigation that we talked about earlier this week. And they're both considered more moderate Republicans. What that means is they're kind of more down the middle. They're not seated on either side of the left or the right. They're kind of more down the middle, and they appealed to more people. And so when the Republicans win in 1952, it was a big change, and it was very significant. One of the things that he established was the interstate highway system, okay, which we obviously have today. So before the interstate system, there was, the only way you could get from like Richmond to Lexington would be through back roads, like or routes like US 25 or something like that, which obviously took a lot longer than what we have the interstates today. And so things like I-75, I-64 are meant to connect America's major cities. One of the other things that the interstate was also built for, it was also built as an emergency airstrip for planes to take off or to land if there's ever some sort of nuclear disaster or any sort of Cold War imminent threat that was going on. And so, if they needed to take off in an emergency or land somewhere in an emergency, technically, that's one of the reasons why the interstate was built. Consumerism in the 1950s, so very similar to the 1920s, the post-World War I era. In the 1950s, the economy is doing better, people have more expendable income, and they can buy stuff. And some of these new products they have TV, washing machines, ovens, and several kitchen appliances. And several ads that appeared on TV obviously encouraged this age of consumerism. And this is best highlighted in 1959 when Vice President Richard Nixon went to Moscow. He went to this world, I guess you could call it a fair almost, and the Americans kind of had their kind of setup where they're showing all these great products that were made in the United States, and they're like, look what capitalism, look what consumerism has done, look what it has produced. So they had all sorts of things like a washing machine, kitchen appliances, and Vice President Nixon was making that debate against the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. And it was a debate that was aired in both countries, both the United States and the Soviet Union. And it's really kind of seen as the height of this debate between communism and capitalism. Nixon's saying, hey, look, because of capitalism, we're able to have this, free exchange of ideas, and we're able to have great minds come together and make all these products. And Khrushchev's arguing for communism. And you can see that here in this bottom corner right here. I strongly recommend you watching just a couple minutes of the kitchen debate. It's only like 8 minutes or so. But it's really interesting to see how they debate between the two ideologies. All right, that brings us to an end for today's unit. I will be posting the quiz sometime either late Wednesday or early Thursday. That'll be your last assignment, and then you all have a good spring break.